Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to get this policy party restarted. I hope you've enjoyed your lunch. I hope you are refueled, relaxed, and ready to go. So we have been talking about how good ideas either do or do not get along that path to implementation. We talked about why good ideas aren't enough. That was the first panel, if you recall. The second panel was talking about institutions that typically are responsible for producing and discussing lots of good ideas. Policy schools and think tanks have their mandate to talk about and to develop lots of good ideas. We're now going to take a case study, a deeper dive on a particular institution that is near and dear to my heart, which is an institution that was all about one good idea. And it's something called Canada's Ecofiscal Commission. Some of you do not know what the Ecofiscal Commission is, and that's okay. If you would like to know what the Ecofiscal Commission is all about, I encourage you to go to www.ecofiscal.ca, but don't do it now. Do it later. But what the Ecofiscal Commission was all about, it's kind of a think tank, but it's different than a normal think tank. It was a group of economists who came together 6 years ago to do research on and promote the use of a particular type of policy that, in their assessment, would improve environmental outcomes in this country and improve economic outcomes at the same time, if you did it right. And it was all about pollution pricing. Everything the Ecofiscal Commission did was about pollution pricing. Put a price on pollution, whether you're talking about tailpipe emissions or carbon emissions or anything in between. So we talked about water pricing, congestion pricing, solid waste pricing, but about 2/3 of our work was about carbon pricing and about why carbon pricing was a very good policy and a low-cost policy to use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The Ecofiscal Commission was funded by private money. It was completely independent. It was independent, it didn't take a penny from governments. It was not connected to political parties. It had no dogs in any fights. So it took its money and support from private foundations, family foundations, and some corporations. And over the last 6 years, it wrote a whole bunch of reports and did all kinds of blogs and op-eds and videos and all kinds of stuff to get that idea out. So this panel discussion is about whether the Ecofiscal Commission did a good job, did a bad job, how could it have done better, what was its impact, all of those things. And so what we've done is we've assembled 4 people who aren't ecofiscalers. It would seem a little bizarre to put a bunch of ecofiscal people on the panel to then talk objectively about ecofiscal's impact. So what we've got is 4 people who aren't ecofiscal. But let me introduce to you Andrea Moffat, who's the moderator, because she is interested in ecofiscal. She's the VP of the Ivy Foundation. The Ivy Foundation is one of the 10 or 12 funders of the Ecofiscal Commission. So Andrea Moffat cares about whether the Ecofiscal Commission did a good job or not, because she thinks about it in terms of a return on investment from the Ivy Foundation. So Andrea is going to be more than just a moderator. She's going to be a moderator with more than the usual amount of attitude, even more than Paul Booth showed on the first panel this morning. So let me leave it there with Andrea. Andrea can introduce the panelists, and let's get going on Ecofiscal. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And yeah, I'm going to try and rival Paul on the attitude, but I'm not sure if I'll totally make it. So I'm going to be the not neutral, not objective moderator, and I'm going to jump in with sort of comments from sort of an Ivy perspective and sort of how we've worked with Ecofiscal. And this is, Chris is a brave man because he has set up this panel to essentially be a live evaluation of his work. And we're excited to be able to take on that challenge because it's going to be a lot of fun. So we have a great panel here. The first person here is Andrew Leach, and he is an energy and environmental economist from the University of Calgary. Then I have Bill Watson. He's an economist and a columnist for the National Post. He's retired from McGill just a couple of years ago. We've got David McLaughlin. He's a climate and sustainability policy expert, or policy wonk, as some people would say. He's been advising the Manitoba government on climate change, and he was the former CEO of the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy. So we have a very esteemed panel with lots of opinions, and we've decided that we're going to sort of get started with a series of couple of questions, and I'm going to really try and spur a little bit of a debate amongst the panelists, because I don't think we're all in agreement around the ecofiscal, the approach, and all things. So it should be good. So I think I'm going to start with you, David, at the far end, and the first question is, what did the Ecofiscal do well? What are some sort of examples where you feel like they really supported the adoption of good public policy?
Well, at the risk of alienating a lot of good friends and colleagues here, I'll only pick one thing, but there were a number of things that Ecofiscal did well. But I do want to just clarify, take some exception to Chris's characterization of Ecofiscal, because at least as I see it, I never saw Ecofiscal as a think tank. I saw it as an advocacy tank, if you will. One good idea, and a very good idea with lots of elements to it, lots of dimensions and richness to it, that it took and pushed and promoted and filled out and helped make real, and has had a significant public policy and political impact in the country. So that's not chump change, that's no small thing. But it is not, and never has been in my judgment, a classic sort of think tank. Its research papers, its commentary has been around principally carbon pricing, but also market-based instruments in the environmental field. The one good thing that, I don't want to say it that way, a good thing, I think is a more accurate way to say it. A good thing that Ecofiscal did, I want to speak from personal experience, is when Chris and company Dale came to Manitoba. So I was helping the Premier of Manitoba develop a climate plan. That was my penance for running his campaign, and we won, and oh yeah, David, stay and write a climate plan. Okay, fine. We're conservatives, right? So it was never going to be easy. But we had put carbon pricing in our platform, undefined. We weren't crazy, we wanted to win. And then new federal government, and this thing was building some momentum. So we were moving in this field, and as I moved the internal government public policy community, and then reached out to stakeholders to talk about how we should do this, I recognized I needed a third party to help me do it. And Chris and Dale and company came to Manitoba. We had a one-day session, and it was, I ran it, but I hosted it, Chris ran it, and made certain that folks left with a good understanding of what carbon pricing is and what it isn't. And it helped further our understanding, that helped give us a better underpinning of what carbon pricing could do in the Manitoba context and what it couldn't do. So that's one very good thing, and I'm still very grateful for it, and has in fact influenced our work.
Okay, Bill, what about you? Any influence of Ecofiscal? What's a good thing?
Yeah, let me just say, when Chris asked me to be on this panel, and also said that this was a kind of a funeral panel for Ecofiscal, or maybe a wake panel, because Ecofiscal ends December 31st, and it lives on a little afterwards as they clean up the books. Might take a while. My first thought was Julius Caesar. I think it's obvious, right? It's kind of. I come to bury Ecofiscal, not to praise it, as Mark Antony said in his famous speech at the funeral of Julius Caesar. And he went on and said, "The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones." And that's as ghoulish as I will. That's as ghoulish as I will get. We're asked to say good things about Ecofiscal. Of course, as you remember...
This is the good section.
That's right, this is the good section.
I'm like afraid.
Mark Antony was not entirely truthful in his comments, because, of course, Caesar was very unpopular, and Brutus, who had organized the killing, was very popular at the moment. There's a rabble listening to this speech. So he starts off in that way. So we don't, the first bits of the speech, we're not entirely sure if he believes them or not, because the great genius of his rhetoric, which you won't see replicated here today, is that he turns the crowd, and the crowd ends up wanting revenge for the death of Caesar, this person that he had come to bury and not to praise. Anyway, that was the first thought I had. The second thought I have is a little more prosaic. What always impressed me about Ecofiscal was the production values. I'm just a little humble person. I have email. That's about as far as I get in social media. And I'm used to documents that are basically print and not much else. And the documents I would get from Ecofiscal were just terrific. Lots of color, beautiful layouts. I work in the newspaper business. I was really impressed by the layouts. It was terrific stuff. You know, it's leading edge. You got to do that. Now, of course, that's, I think these days, probably a necessary, but not a sufficient condition. We see lots of stuff that's really well laid out. We saw 4 or 5 party platforms in the recent election that were beautifully laid out with, wonderful pictures of the leader's hands, and the leader talking to a baby, and the leader communing with people. Production values were great. The content was somewhat disappointing. But I think with Ecofiscal, I was always, I didn't read everything by any means. I understand there were 750 blogs. I think I read maybe 1 or 2. But I did read a couple of documents, and what impressed me was that there was substance there too. I always saw it as kind of reporting on state-of-the-art research. What does the literature, what does the economics literature in particular, say about this question that we're examining? So I always admired it. Great production values, and I thought terrific content. You know, as an economist, I'm scanning the NBER weekly feed of papers that are coming out, and you kind of try to keep track of that stuff. And clearly the people who are writing Ecofiscal reports were doing exactly the same thing. So I think the stuff you got was high quality and not necessarily leading edge, but just beyond, just behind, just reporting the state of the art.
Good. Andrew?
You're not invited to my funeral. So arguably the best thing Ecofiscal has done has allowed me to be one of the 4 people who got to watch Chris's face during that particular discussion. And it was phenomenal. You all missed it because you were looking up here, but he's right there, and it was really well worth it. So I think Chris highlighted on it when he said one big idea. But importantly, what he did was manage to bring together academics with quite diverse viewpoints on a lot of issues and figure out where their points of agreement were. And to get that point of agreement on, not necessarily a policy per se, but a set of tools, a toolkit. And to really restrict, or at least to try to restrict, their work to where that agreement lay. And Dale and I were talking about this earlier, so I'm sort of stealing a bit here, but I think that is really the essence of it, was to say there is a point of consensus here. I think we will talk about the negatives in a bit, and I think one of the problems was how far that got pushed. Did we get ourselves outside of the point of consensus? And I don't think that was Ecofiscal's fault. But I think demonstrating that, I think providing a close on a big gap that was there after the National Roundtable was wrapped up, and that sort of arm's length analysis to be able to tell people where are we going, what are we doing. Sorry, David, it's funeral time up here, so we have to talk about these things. But where are we going from a national perspective? What are the policy tools? And Ecofiscal didn't have all of the range to be able to get there, but it was super useful. I'll pick up on David's point, though. I had a wonderful experience. I'm having a little bit of PTSD with Rachel Notley and Brian Topp here, but I had a wonderful experience designing Alberta's climate policy, or helping to design Alberta's climate policy, and Ecofiscal played a huge role in that. And so like David, we invited Chris and Dale out to lead one of our engagement sessions to really frame the debate. But in the follow-up to that, every question that came up there was an Ecofiscal report that came sometimes 6 months after it came up, which we could have sped that up, but I think we helped Ecofiscal by showing where all the gaps in the analysis lay. I think Ecofiscal helped the policy implementation a great deal by, for whatever the big questions were, the concerns that people had, okay, I'm going to bring that report forward in a way that was far more accessible and far better pushed out into the public domain than we would have seen. I won't talk about production values or layouts, but than we would have seen from just the academic research or from just the political spin. So that's my take.
Good. All right, I want to build on stuff a little bit because I do think one of the things that was really unique about Ecofiscal was the amount of sort of time and effort that went into actually designing it. So there was a lot of folks that got together with Chris, including some of my colleagues, Bruce Laurie and Lauren Johnson, around how do you actually create something that can have a real impact within, a reasonable period of time, not a short period of time, but a time where you can actually make something happen within. And so I think the idea of bringing together really leading thinkers in terms of the commissioners from across the country, I think the advisors across political parties, across different private sector and public sector expertise, and then putting together like an extremely high quality staff to really be able to have the capacity to deliver it was really unique. And of course, Chris does have a really unique ability. He's a great communicator and he's really politically savvy. So I think bringing that together in one place at a moment in time when we needed to make some things happen is quite unique, doesn't always happen, and sort of builds off some of the recommendations of the earlier panels. What's that window? How do you take that window? How are you ready to actually build on impact through that? And I think the communications and government relations kind of component of it is what sort of maybe differentiates Ecofiscal in terms of, is it a think tank? Is it sort of an advocacy group? Is it part of sort of an institute structure? But a lot of detail was put into that. And I wasn't a part of this, but I heard when Ecofiscal was launched, there was this huge conversation around who should actually cover the launch. And a lot of effort went into making sure it was the business press. Like the focus was having it covered by the business press. So right off the bat, it would have this credibility within the mainstream economic markets. And that, to me, is really brilliant. And I think that level of sort of detail and strategic analysis, which lots of others that were affiliated with Ecofiscal helped make happen, was super critical for some of the great successes of Ecofiscal. So this has been great. We've been praising Chris. We've had a funeral, and we're only on the first question. But now we're going to really get into what's tough. So here we go. Are you ready, Chris? Are you ready for this? What could the Ecofiscal have done better? And we want some clear examples. And Bill, because you led with the funeral, you get to start this one.
Okay. Well, I've made 2 points. One is very, very small. The name. I think I got the original memo when Chris was thinking about this and he was asking for opinion about it. And my reaction was, you're a commission. Who commissioned you? Right? You're not. You're self-commissioned. Right? And in my newspaper, that fact led every paragraph that was ever written about the Ecofiscal Commission. It wasn't left-leaning or right-leaning. It was self-commissioned commission. So the Ecofiscal Group, the Ecofiscal Lobby, the Ecofiscal Assembly, the Ecofiscal, just call it the Ecofiscal. It's a small point, but I think it could have been cleared up quite easily. The Ecofiscal Commission is almost dead, so its name doesn't matter anymore. The bigger problem, I guess, when the commission started, one province had carbon pricing, and when the commission finished, all provinces have carbon pricing, whether they like it or not. And so, by the normal standards of politics, on your watch, you did really well. I think I know that there are remaining problems. The problems are conservatives and losers. And they're not the same thing, really.
It feels like that sometimes. So.
I know it feels like that. I know in this room that there's an unspoken consensus. The conservative problem is, of course, the problem of what to do with the money. And is this not just a ruse that people who want a bigger public sector are attaching themselves to so that there'll be a nice big flow of funds in that they can do with as they please? And from a conservative position, that's something that we don't want, right? We want to price carbon. Not all conservatives do, but this conservative wants to price carbon because I can understand the reasons why we should do that. But I don't want a bigger government. And if you're going to have serious conversations with business and with conservatives, you've got to explain how the money is going to be returned. And I think you've really got to work on the pre-commitment problem, right? You can promise, we're going to take it, we're going to recycle it, right? Okay, we've heard promises before. And conservatives are by nature very skeptical. And so we don't believe the promise. I don't know, I don't have an answer to how you do the pre-commitment. Maybe you start sending out the checks. Maybe you send out a lifetime check, which you can't take back. You know, you're going to be subject to carbon pricing for the next 10 years. Here's a check that covers the whole thing for 10 years, and you put it in your account, and we can't seize it. Maybe you could do that. So it's a difficult problem, but I think it's a problem. Now, I didn't read everything Ecofiscal put out, so maybe you have a volume on exactly how you handle pre-commitment. I know you had a volume on what to do with the money, and give it all back, and pre-commit was, I think, one of the papers, but not all of the papers. The second problem, of course, is losers. No matter how careful you are, no matter how much you recycle, there are going to be some people that lose. And when you're changing in a big way a major price in the economy, that's not a trivial number of people that are going to be hurt. And you know, in economics, the answer we give is, okay, you make a deal. You know, you buy them off, and for supply management, we want to buy them off and make sure that they're not, they can't make them whole, but you can make them 90% or 80%. And I don't think that problem's been solved. Now, if Ecofiscal had solved that problem, this would be a kind of world-shattering event because it's a problem in all sorts of policy. But with a policy that's working on a big, important price and wants to change it a lot, you're going to have millions of people who are going to get hurt. And what do you do with them? Don't know.
Losers. Okay, Andrew.
I think probably how many people in this room take in second-year environmental econ? Probably like a few, right? Now, earlier we heard about who taught Jack Mintz macro. I learned environmental econ from Nancy Ohlweiler's textbook. And one of the pieces of that is, you know, you learn about stringency of policies, and then you learn about the cost effectiveness of policies. And the point of agreement amongst the Ecofiscal commissioners was if you were implementing a given policy to accomplish something, the most cost-effective way to do it was carbon pricing. The way that's been translated by basically everybody is that on every dimension, a carbon price is the best policy or a pollution price is the best policy. And I think that's caused us to lose sight of the first order problem, which is you're trying to internalize the externality. So if I say to most people, you know, do you think a carbon price is better than regulation? They'll nod and say, absolutely. You know, would you trade a 25 cent a ton carbon price for a coal phase out nationally by 2030? Absolutely not. Right? Because people fundamentally realize what they care about is stringency. When they're agreeing around carbon pricing, they're agreeing implicitly about different levels of stringency. And I think Ecofiscal, if I were to pinpoint one thing, and I don't think it's not your fault, right? It's not the fault of Ecofiscal, but it ended up sort of talking past the key problem. But in a way, they were the only voice in the room on some of these issues, so they ended up being adopted by people who were trying to use their research to say what their research didn't say. And so I think that's maybe the challenge. But, you know, put out a challenge, talk about potential solutions. I don't know that you could have solved that, right? Because you can't solve that on the model that you have, because that's where the consensus is going to break down. We can put, you know, 17, what are we calling them? Autonomously collective academics interested in public policy or something. But we can put them all in a room and they can agree on one element. They're not going to agree on stringency. Right? They're not going to agree on, it might not even agree on means of application. They might not even agree on coverage, all of these sorts of things. And so that makes your challenge really hard. And I think what you ended up with was people using your research to take it further than it needed to be taken.
Good. Maybe I'll jump in with one comment and then bring David in. So I think Ecofiscal was put into a situation where they were trying to create something when you can't actually completely control the end game of stuff. And so the and then the sort of spotlight on carbon pricing really became synonymous with climate change, right? So it was carbon pricing was climate change. And we all know that that's not 100% of the policy fix. We know that like some of the biggest benefits would be from different types of things like building codes, fuel standards, et cetera. But the real focus in the country became carbon pricing. And we even had a study done where we had a look at sort of policy papers and media coverage over the past 5 years. And in terms of the airtime on the solution side, it was by far skewed towards carbon pricing, and much less attention on these other things that were going to actually result in more greenhouse gas emission reductions, and they just weren't getting the attention by the media and politicians. So, and that's not totally Ecofiscal's fault. It's sort of what was happening, but it is sort of what happens. It was almost like being so successful that you like skewed us the other way, which is sort of interesting. Anyways, David, your turn.
I'd like to pick up on both on that comment, Andrea, but also what Andrew said. And unlike Chris, who said don't look at, go to the website, I'm going to invite you to look at an article I published today in Policy Options, which would not have been sanctioned by Ecofiscal because it talks about a compromise price on carbon for the West. It's called The West Wants In on Carbon. Really, it is, believe it or not. And it shows what I think is, I don't say it's maybe a weakness or an inadequacy of the one big idea approach to, in an advocacy tank or organization such as this. And it's the fixation on the instrument, if you will, over the outcomes. And so the intellectual sort of dialectic I'd have with the Ecofiscal folks and acknowledged by them was, okay, what are we trying to do here? I mean, is it just get a carbon price in place? Is that the end all be all? Or is it actually to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And so in the Manitoba case, and then why that became really important to me is I was looking in a real world example, like what could we do with carbon pricing in Manitoba, where in Manitoba the grid is already clean. So there's no, low hanging fruit in terms of a low carbon price that you can actually get emission reductions, where it has the largest proportion of agriculture emissions in the country, and everybody says we're not going to touch the farmers with emission pricing for the most part. So there wasn't that much to work with. And so an economy-wide carbon price in Manitoba covered about 50% of the economy versus 80% probably in Alberta, something of much higher percentage. So it was an imperfect instrument, but it was still an instrument. Now, this wasn't necessarily Ecofiscal's fault. It was the federal government's fault. It was not perhaps ready to look at something else like that. But we looked at carbon pricing. We modeled it. We did all the same sort of stuff. In fact, we just finished a bit of modeling in anticipation perhaps of a maybe more chastened and open federal government. On verra. But their price going up to $50 a ton, rising price, compared to say a flat 30, the difference is you get an extra 100,000 tons of emission reductions. 100,000 tons over the period to 2022 in Manitoba. But we need $50 a ton. $50 a ton, that's an extra, well, every $10 a ton is about $250 million in taxpayers' money and everything else. So a carbon price as defined by the federal government, based very much on the Ecofiscal model I would submit, had inadequacies. And so that's not necessarily Ecofiscal's fault or doing, but it was what would have been richer for me and other practitioners in this field would have been to have that kind of teasing out of the limits of carbon pricing in certain ways and where it could coexist or nest with other kinds of instruments. And there was aspects of that. The output-based pricing work that Ecofiscal did was, in my view, very strong and captured those nuances much better and would have. Great to have that as a deeper dive on some other things. So it's an inadequacy. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it flowed from the type of model, mission, organization that Ecofiscal was set up to be, and perhaps it was inevitable.
Andrew, did you want to do a follow-up on that?
It's stringency, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think the output-based pricing stuff is an example of some of the things that maybe Ecofiscal did well, but I think was also following policy, right? That was, and that came out of Alberta's policy, and then the federal policy built off that. And we'd talked about it. We'd done it in Alberta since 2007 in one way.
Yeah.
It was something that was maligned for a couple of really wonkish reasons about incentives and such things. But that was a huge change. But it started, I think, with policy. And then what Ecofiscal was able to do that maybe in some ways we weren't able to do in Alberta was respond to the critiques and explain it and make sure that once the different questions came out about the policy, to keep banging the drum and say, this is why this marginal price matters. This is why we don't really care as much about output-based allocations as you might think. This is why average costs. And then it's stuff you learn about again. It's like that boring second half of a class in second year environmental econ, but it actually came to matter. And so Dale and Chris and everybody had to turn around and say, how can I explain this to people so that they care? And we saw a really good example of that probably this past week or so, or 2 weeks in Alberta, was Alberta changed its carbon policy. The most important thing by far that Alberta did with its change in carbon policy was it kept the treatment on electricity. Everybody's focused on, oh my goodness, they took out the consumer carbon price, but they kept the treatment on electricity. They didn't change the price, but they kept the output-based pricing system that was put in under Rachel Notley's government, and that's probably going to make, call it an order of magnitude more difference in emissions out of Alberta than the consumer carbon price would have made at $30 a ton. But they could have walked away from that in a way that would never have reached anybody but the policy wonks. They could easily have walked away from it, but they didn't. And so explaining why it matters in that little kind of, and we could talk about that forever, but explaining why those little policy details matter was a huge role and a huge positive.
Yeah, that fits well with some of the earlier panel's discussions around this idea of, how do you get the right window? How do you have the right evidence? How do you have the right development? And then how do you get the adoption in different ways? And the adoption piece is not always what you expect, but it can have good implications. So let's move on to sort of the final big bucket of conversation, which is really, the Ecofiscal Commission could be used as a great example for how to deal with other types of policy issues. And I want to hear what you think about that. Is it a good model? Should we be building on it? Should we be creating all sorts of institutions based on this model? What are your sort of examples on that?
Do I get to start on this one?
Sure.
So I think the model worked really well. We talked about what's the big idea. It was people coming together around something they all agreed upon and could come out behind a common position. So I think you have to start with that and say, what are the areas where we can have those common positions? And the challenge of stretching it out is really on most policy problems, we're not talking about the means, we're talking about the ends. And if we turn around and turn all of our conversations into ones about the means, what tool are we going to swing to solve this problem, then we might be distracting away from thinking about the ends. The other thing I would say, and this is maybe a chance to reference Dick Lipsey again, who's in the room, but to think about, we know that all of these individual policies exist in a larger space. So climate policy in Canada, it exists in a very fractured global environment. There's a whole global, international climate change convention, quote unquote, market that exists. For all of these policy problems, there are a whole bunch of distortions around political ones, international ones, local ones, other policies that overlap. And I think the challenge of focusing really down on this, what is the most cost-effective solution to this problem in a very particular vacuum, you have to be careful not to lose that. And that was Dick Lipsey's theory of the second best, that what might look like the optimal policy in a vacuum in this problem might actually not be the optimal policy when you wrap all of the constraints around it. And so I think, you know, the risk of the model is if you focus too far down on the means, you forget about the broader environment, and that makes things challenging.
Great. David, do you want to jump in?
Well, I'm not privy to the sort of internal machinations of the commission and how it decided things and made choices and did its research. I'm only, you know, I can only comment on the output. And you know, in politics, there's a saying: you make your own luck in politics, or you know, if you have good luck in politics, it's really good, and bad luck is really bad. Well, Ecofiscal was lucky. It came at a time when a new federal government said, well, we want to do something in this area. And so a counterfactual might be, would the commission have been as successful in terms of influencing public policy if it did not have a willing dance partner? And I think the federal government, federal Liberal government, was clearly a willing dance partner, as were some provincial governments. Now, that's not to say it wouldn't have been influential, or to a certain degree. It might have, however, gone in some different direction. Might have invested more in some primary research or some other kinds of things. Might have made some different kinds of choices on that. But so replicating that model, to me, leaving aside the funding and the commissioners and all that kind of stuff, you would have to think about what would be the public policy issue that it could drive. And I like that idea because it does complement existing public policy schools and think tanks, but it's sort of a get in and get out of Dodge thing, right? You know, 5 years, you're done. And you have something to show for it. And maybe that kind of entrepreneurial policy dynamic is something the country could use, because we're not really getting things done in certain ways. And so I like the idea of something that can kind of cross-cut and bring sort of dynamism and energy to do things. But you also need a confluence of stuff. And so, you know, is it the Panasonic thing? You know, it used to be, you know, just slightly ahead of our time or something like that. That was the round table, right? We were just slightly ahead. But in this case, I really like, I think the power of the Ecofiscal was that it met the moment, or did the moment meet them? Either way, it doesn't matter. In a way, it just had that power and that influence. So there are some things to draw upon, but you know, you couldn't do a checklist and say, okay, let's just go apply it over, over here, you know, for every instance.
All right, I'm going to come back to you and Andrew also on examples, like what examples you might have of new things that would use the model. But Bill.
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is don't call it a commission. But you know, it's a rare thing when you get all these economists to agree. And I guess the agreement was over the fact that we got something here that is not priced, and it really should be priced. I can't think of, economists tend to like consumption taxes, you know, the let's have more consumption taxes commission. I wasn't going to call it a commission, a lobby.
It's not great.
I don't think that's going to turn anybody's crank. One thing where there's near unanimity is supply management. And so the Supply Management Destruction Commission would be, you know, very popular among economists, but you know, maybe this is a case where you have lots of constraints and we're not recognizing the constraints. I like the idea of get in and get out. I like the fact that this thing comes to an end. I'm saddened by it, I must say, but you know, it's fixed term, and you got a job, you do the job, you do it the best you can. And then you let other mechanisms take over, perhaps having left the field with, you know, much more understanding than you entered it with. So yes, in principle, I like the model. In practice, I don't have any suggestions for where it could go next.
Okay. I might weigh in with an example, because I do think that there are some lessons learned from Ecofiscal that are useful for totally different issues. And one that I'm spending a bunch of time on is sustainable finance. And we're creating an Institute of Sustainable Finance at the Smith School of Business. And we're going to be using some of the design and governance aspects of Ecofiscal to help with building that type of a pretty complex, I would say, issue that involves a lot of different types of stakeholders. And one of the things we're looking at is sort of a bastardization of the commissioner model, and that would be setting up sort of basically a whole pile of different universities that are going to work together based on sort of finance academics coming around the table. And right now we've got about 16 universities and 40 finance academics that are willing to work together on this issue. We also looked at the Ecofiscal Advisory Board model and how they had a mix of different influencers. So in terms of the board, advisory board for this institute, it's going to have a lot of financial sector representatives. It's going to have pension funds, banks, asset managers, economists, Don Drummond, a bunch of academics to sort of really make sure that this is going to be applied demanded for research versus just the pure academic research. And then finally, this idea that communications is super important and should be really, really sophisticated, the communication side of things. So hopefully we can build that strong capability. So a lot of that is modeled on sort of how Ecofiscal came together, which is great. And we'll see whether this is going to be something that could work for this institute, which is going to be launched next week. So just to follow up, so as foundations, we invested quite a bit of money in Ecofiscal and the team. And so I wanted to come to each of you and sort of to be like, would you be an investor in Ecofiscal? Would you have been an investor? And if so, would you have thought that you got value from it?
How much? What's it going to cost me?
Dragon's Den stuff.
So
yeah, that's right.
What do you think, Bill? It sounds like you maybe wanted to be an investor and were sort of reluctant at first.
Well, I'm a longtime friend of Chris Reagan, and I have the greatest admiration for his ability and enthusiasm. And I could go on. I won't because it's not his funeral. So yeah, in terms of an investment in human capital, sure, I would have done that. My best investments are always ex post. And so, ex post, I think, I think it's worked out. I think it's had an influence. How do you judge influence? You folks have seen Chris operating on various influence makers and deciders and so on. We see the avalanche of stuff that comes in from Ecofiscal. It's probably having an influence. Do you have any data on how many people read each of the 100-page reports? It's difficult to do, but ex post, it seems to me it was a success.
All right, so we got one investor.
Well, yeah.
Andrew?
I think the biggest thing that Ecofiscal and things like it do, and feeds into the previous discussion on policy schools as well, is that it creates the incentive for academics to do things that people actually read. That it creates incentives that would not otherwise exist for academics to engage in public policy. And so if you look at, and I'll pick on Chris, even though it's not your funeral, right? The list of things, the policy influence that Ecofiscal has had, or that, textbooks have had, would be the other example, are orders of magnitude larger than most of our academic papers will be. The number of people, no matter how many people read the Ecofiscal report on revenue recycling, I can guarantee you it's more people than read my Wood Hotel and Gilly electric car paper, right? And anything else I've ever written in an academic journal. So creating that environment where not only there's an ability to do it, but there's also an ecosystem of bringing younger academics in. And I had the advantage when I was starting out in this world. It was the National Roundtable that created that space where I could come in, I could write some stuff, lower risk, someone else handling a lot of the presentation and everything else. I could work behind the scenes. I got some time at Environment Canada that helped as well. But Ecofiscal created that space where writing these kinds of things was important and it was something that mattered. Policy schools create that space. So yeah, absolutely, put money into these types of things, but don't necessarily think the model's going to work everywhere. There's different ones that'll be suited for different types of investments on the edge of academia.
Great, thanks. David?
Well, I wouldn't be an uninterested investor. A self-interested investor, yeah, I would have put some money in if I could have a voice at the table. To influence what it was doing and how it was doing it. But because it was and is, for the time that's remaining, 6 weeks and counting or something, it was a driven organization. It had a mission. And so if I believed in that mission and wanted to be part of getting it into the public policy sphere and having some influence, which demonstrably was growing for the reasons I mentioned, then yeah, I would have invested in it. Would I have invested in it as a disinterested policy researcher, just to have that stuff out there? Less so, because of the nature of it. So for me, it is about influence and yeah, voice at the table, because I think it could have used some of those other voices too.
So I'll just comment as an investor. We thought it was a good investment. We thought we got pretty full value. And the other thing that we got from it was actually it sort of allowed foundations to really think about this idea of more effective collaboration amongst ourselves and how we support new types of institutional growth in Canada. And how can we work better together to allow long-term investment in those types of things going forward. And one thing that came out of it, or was sort of was developed out of it, was this idea of creating something called the Clean Economy Fund, which is sort of this collaboration of foundations investing in this type of change in the Canadian context. And that's really important because sometimes as funders, I feel like we're not always reflective on what we're doing and how we're like impacting things. And so it's nice to be able to sort of take those lessons learned ourselves and also progress and sort of innovate going forward. So hopefully we'll continue to be able to do that. I feel like there's probably lots of questions from the audience. Should we think about doing some questions? There may be some mics and, okay, we've got Ken.
Not Chris.
I so rarely get the opportunity to ask two Conservatives, both prominent, about carbon pricing. And so my question is very narrow. It's not about the politics, it's about the intellectual arguments. And Bill, both of you, what intellectual argument is missing in the Conservative side of the House that you would urge us to address to get the intellectual argument move forward on the Conservative side for carbon pricing?
Well, the Conservatives are skeptical, as they should be. I think Liberals should be skeptical too. Everybody should be skeptical. It's the Enlightenment, we're skeptical. So we kind of think that, as I said earlier, it might be a ruse for just having a bigger government. It might, even if people don't intend that, it might have that effect. And so how can you reassure us? Now, some parties are not going to reassure us no matter what they say, but maybe within the Conservative grouping, we start talking about how do we build pre-commitments? How do we make sure that the money doesn't get stolen? How do we make sure it gets recycled effectively? I don't know if there's an idea that's missing. I mean, we understand that governments are capable of doing things. They often do very useful things, but perhaps we focus unduly on the things that they screw up. And we fear naturally that something very big like this is going to lead to a very big screw up. So reassure us. That's the, I'm not sure it's a deep philosophical, we don't like government planning of the economy. And I'll admit here, and it's on television, I guess, I'm a friend of Terence Corcoran, and he's very skeptical of Ecofiscal, and he says you got a big price here, and you don't really know what value it should have. Should it be 20, 40, 60, 80? What's the optimal price? The optimal price is the damage we're doing to the planet. Well, calculate that for me. That's a pretty difficult calculation, even if you have the best of intentions and the biggest of computers. I guess my response to that is, well, we're pretty sure it's greater than zero. But we don't know much beyond that. I think those are the concerns that people have.
Do you want to answer, Ken?
Yeah.
I'd start off first with something you said on your panel, which was you talked about the divide amongst Conservatives being more populist versus Conservative. So first thing Conservatives have to do is dampen the populist and bring up the Conservative side, which will bring the policy intellectualism back to it. So which is really where I think you're heading with that. The two things that I think are preventing conservatives, leaving aside the politics of it, which is that they were too successful, in crapping on it years ago. Two things I think that conservatives have trouble with this is the evidence that it actually works if it's market-based instrument. How does it? We know how it works and apply a price, but the evidence of it actually working, there's so much skepticism out there in conservative ranks, so that has to be proven to people, and we need some research on that. I think it can be, because in part, what conservatives have to wrap their heads around is it's not just like reducing absolute growth. You have carbon price on it. It's reducing the rate of growth. It's what it would have been, and we got to get our heads around these counterfactuals. That the second part is what Bill has been talking about, is the skepticism about bigger government and stuff. So I think conservatives should invest some time in thinking about the governance of it. There are mechanisms to make certain, to protect taxpayers, to protect from bigger government. There are things you can do. I mean, it was conservatives who sort of pioneered balanced budget legislation and other kinds of things. Some of it was in the Micharis period, some of it in the reform period, and other. But those kinds of legitimately skeptical sort of approaches. I don't want government to grow. So what constraints can we put around it in legislative terms or political terms or whatever to make certain that this will actually work? And there's some bodies of thinking out there on that can be drawn upon. So I'd go after these are the two things that we conservatives just seem to have so much trouble with. Maybe I did too. Maybe there's the third one. Again, Bill's kind of got me going. Like, what is the bigger piece of the bigger cost of it? It's the insurance concept. I mean, how if we don't do this, what's going to be the impact? And conservatives, if we're traditionalists, we like institutions, but we're also about the longer term. So, I'd give my eye teeth for a political party that was fiscally, look at the long-term fiscal sustainability and long-term environmental sustainability. I mean, that to me would be a great mix. And so conservatives talk about long-term fiscal, sustainability and debt and everything else. Don't seem to apply the same thinking concept to the issue of environmental sustainability and climate change, which is really an intergenerational thing. So those areas would, and they all require new research, some thinking on it that I think conservatives should lead. Right?
Can I take a bat at that too, even though I guess I didn't count as one of your two conservatives on the stage? I don't know, there's one of us wearing an orange pocket square, man, it's not me. So I think there's a way, to think of this in a slightly different way too, and it's to look at the conservatives and the way they think about the oil and gas industry. And if you think of what Canadians have been asked to believe by conservatives of late, it's that the oil sands are the engine of Canada's economy, something that we should be focusing on for the future, and that if anyone does something which costs 25 cents a barrel, the whole thing is going to flee and explode. So it's the marginally profitable engine of Canada's future economy. That's not a bet that anyone's going to be willing to make, and I think carbon pricing can be the bridge there, because you're going to get, I mean, John's here from Suncor, but you're going to get some of the big companies who say, absolutely, put us on a level playing field, put our industry on the same playing field as everybody else, put our industry on the same playing field as cars, and that was a lot of what we tried to push with Rachel Notley's policy then, was exactly that. Put Alberta on the same playing field as Quebec. Let's talk about carbon price. Let's not talk about, relative to some arbitrary year in the past. And I think that's maybe the intellectual anchor for some changes, which is to say, if you put everyone on a level playing field, I do think that our oil and gas industry has a lot of good stories to tell and a lot of things that can compete, and that carbon pricing gets you there. You're never going to get Canadians there when you're trying to have two conversations, which is carbon pricing is going to bankrupt the oil sands industry. Oh, they're the lowest emissions barrels in the world and they're going to be net zero by 2035. Those two don't square.
Okay. I think we've got time for like a couple more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, before I make my question, just one small comment. I'm grateful to you for mentioning my general theory of second best, but as I point out in my article 50 years after, this is the kind of policy issue that is not subject to serious second-best considerations. So without bothering you with a lecture on economic theory, anytime you want to write me, I'll explain. I thought a lot about this, and second-best considerations are not a serious matter in this type of policy issue. Now, my question, I've been on dozens and dozens of policy panels over my lifetime, and this seems to me, if not unique, unusual in the amount of time that we were not top-down. The typical one starts up and figures out what's best and then tells people what they should be doing. We started and right through talked to the people we were affecting, talked to the municipalities and the governments, and worked out what we were doing in consultation with the people affected. And secondly, we had political advice, and we tried to anticipate what the political objections would be, and rather than counterpunch, meet those objections in the original paper. Now, I'd like to ask you whether both of those seem to you to be reasonable policies, and am I being over complimentary by saying these are not usual approaches in policy subjects?
David, do you want to start?
They're definitely not usual approaches. If you are overtly taking into account political considerations in your policy research, then you're harder pressed to use the word independent to characterize yourself. It is smart, and we've heard a lot about the need to be relevant and that, but to what extent, and again, Ecofiscal can only answer this, but to what extent did you adjust, amend, configure, calibrate, recalibrate your advice to meet the political moment? Did you publish something? Did you not publish something? Did you change the words? Did you not change the words? That, that's your call. That was Ecofiscal Commission's call, on it. And it's like the old saying: nobody likes to see the sausage made, right? So that part of the sausage making is your DNA, if you will. It was either how you constructed yourself, and I guess it goes to the model in certain respects. But it was unique, and did, as a user of the research and stuff, was I aware of the, I'll say, the small p political titration that occurred? Yeah. And so I would have to, if I was, as I did try to take this work and bring it in a practical way to government, I had to position and utilize, and I found the folks at Ecofiscal very accommodating, in that. But it's real, and I do find it kind of interesting, and maybe somebody should write a paper about it.
Any other responses? There's a question at the front. Yeah.
I just have to say there's life goals, and one of them is having Dick Lipsey thank you for a citation. then there's things that make you sink in your chair, which is being told you've cited them incorrectly. And so I'm sort of sunk down in my chair up here. But I do think there's an element of this that is still fits at least the way that I think of it, which is you're dealing in overlapping markets. And the one example that I would bring up, I think about the one Rachel Notley announced her climate policy on, was it November 21st or 22nd? 21st? 21st. Whatever day it was a Sunday afternoon, there was a football playoff game. People were really upset about having to be there that day. But what people don't often remember is what went on the next day. And so you focus on this as being, it was about carbon pricing, it was about Alberta acting on climate change. But the really important thing that went on the next day, does anyone remember, what went on the next day? It was a First Minister's meeting. It was Justin Trudeau's First Minister's meeting as Prime Minister. He opened it with a briefing for all of the premiers on the science of climate change. The message was very clear. And what was the point of, or what was one of the aspects of Alberta coming out with a policy on Sunday was you changed the entire frame, right? Alberta went into that meeting, and the front page of the Globe and Mail was Alberta, I don't even remember what the headline was, Brian probably does, but Alberta completely changed the game. It changed the market, it changed the allegiances, and that was one of the constraints under which Alberta's policy was operating. 3 weeks later, there was another big one, which was everybody going to Paris. And that's not a pure externality pricing market. It matters what you're doing, it matters how you're doing it, it matters how you're selling it, and how you fit into the global world. And so your policy has to take in those macro level things, but then there's also the micro. And the micro one would be electricity. And so we talk as economists, we say, great, put a price on carbon, let the market respond as it will. But Alberta doesn't have a price on reliability in its electricity industry. And so if the market participants decide to respond to that price by exiting the market, that creates a lot of distortion. If oil companies decide to shut in production because of a high average cost on carbon pricing, that has other distortions in other markets. And I think sometimes we sort of lose that by just saying, well, what's the problem? There's an externality, let's price it. So that was the intention, but I don't know if it translated right.
Good, thank you.
Hi. So, Andrew, you spoke about Ecofiscal finding agreement on a set of tools. Oh my goodness. Fine. I'll stand. Finding agreement on a set of tools to address carbon pricing. And I'm wondering, were there any tools or areas of research that you wanted to see Ecofiscal take up that didn't happen because they weren't all agreed upon?
That's a good question, but I don't, I feel like in some ways, at the time, it would have been, the revenue recycling paper would have been the one that I would have liked to have had in hand when we were doing the Alberta work, right? It would have been nice to have that as a way to frame the issue. And what happened, I think, was that, as we went forward in Alberta, as Prime Minister Trudeau went forward with his policies, et cetera, we were sort of figuring out as we went what the, where we needed better explanations, where we needed better ways to frame the problem for people, that sometimes coming at it as economists, we don't necessarily see that as a blind spot, because this is something we've learned since we read Nancy's book in second year, and it's all ingrained in us. And so figuring out what those were, and Ecofiscal was able to respond to it. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's fair to say I wish they would have been there beforehand, because I don't know that it's reasonable to expect them to have been there before. But we're picking on Chris, so maybe it's your fault they weren't there. They weren't there early.
Group project.
Yeah.
Good, David
The
Scott.
commission.
On that, I would have found it useful to have had sectoral work done, like applications of pricing and how it works in conjunction with other measures, particularly in areas of the bioeconomy, agriculture, a really tough area for us to get at in terms of pricing and just making farmers, change behavior in certain things. Transportation sector. I mean, like we have this broad-based market instrument, and we're asking it to do an awful lot. It'll just, the logic is, and it's not what was really propagated by Ecofiscal, formally, but we're asking it to do all the heavy lifting. And the reality is, you've got to get into the sectors and remove barriers that would allow the price to work, if that is your main instrument. And in some cases, we know that the price is insufficient. You need regulatory backstops and other kinds of things. So getting at it in a more sectoral level, I think would have helped, and will help policymakers come to grips with it. Because then you're starting to work with your stakeholders and in a different way as well, instead of sort of a broader base piece. And looking at things like, as I say, natural solutions and carbon sinks and other kinds of stuff, that would be a new area. I mean, just an area to push the frontier a bit that I think would be helpful.
Good. At the back?
I just had a question about whether there was an opportunity here to think about better decision-making frameworks for these kinds of large problems. As everything...
Speak up.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
As things are becoming more global and their problems are becoming more global, financial stability being one example, environment being another example, I wonder if there's an opportunity for this commission to think through decision-making frameworks that are better suited for these kinds of long-term policy decisions. Because what I hear is less disagreement on the question, but more the placement of the burden of proof. I don't agree until you show me why, or you show me why not. And so you can agree on the question, but you can't come to good decisions if it's a burden of proof kind of decision-making process. And I'm just throwing it out there whether or not there is a better or a new way of making these kinds of decisions or even approaching them.
Bill, do you want to take that on?
No, I don't. 'Cause I'm sorry, I didn't hear it very well, and I'm not sure I understood it, so.
Yeah. Sort of the long-term angle and sort of whether the ecofiscal model provides for that.
Well, I can only, I'll approach it from a political angle, which is you got to live to fight another day. And a lot of the focus around big policy changes that governments make is you got to get them in place, and they got to last beyond the first news cycle. Then you got to win the next day's news cycle. Then you got to go on from that. There's a sustaining need for this stuff, and so governments, by sort of definition, you end up bringing things back into a more manageable sphere. And so governments are not unaware of these longer term implications, and that it would be really great to have this policy framework applied across the piece, for example. But then, you've got interests and stakeholders, and so you start to, well, we've got to mitigate it for a little bit over here, and these guys will be in, but not right away, and we'll transition this, and we'll do all that. And before too long, that becomes your long-term policy. But, in politics, you also, you need a little bit of, sugar to help the medicine go down. So if you're taking tough decisions on stuff, you've got to put some stuff out there for the populace, the voters, to come along. And I think in this case, I've always been been more of a champion of getting the carbon pricing framework in place than I am dogmatic about a certain price or a certain thing. I think you get it in place when people will get acclimatized to it, they'll relax about it, and it'll just make more sense. And then policymakers can adjust it and do the other kinds of things that are needed. The world will not fall apart, unless you put $150 a ton like the day after tomorrow. But certainly nothing that's ever been contemplated or is being contemplated will have these kind of serious deleterious impacts. And we have good research from Ecofiscal and others to show that. So that's the only way I can answer sort of the longer term sort of approach to this.
I think,
if it makes sense to you.
I'd jump in on that too, is to say, the problem might be global, particularly for climate change, but that's not the case with all of the, I was looking at my bottle earlier to see if there was a refund in Quebec. So, remember that not all environmental problems are global. Some of them are very local, but also policy's local. And the impacts of those policies, William mentioned on the way in, or on the lead in, that you're going to have people who lose from these policies. And who those people are changes a lot depending on where you are. And if you think of the broader approach you get, the more likely you are to lose those people. So I'll tell you guys a quick story from Alberta that we did public town halls. Now, if you're going to put someone in the role of hosting town halls, I am not your person. Sorry. I am not really the person who should be asked to do that. But during one of those events, there was like a 45-minute lineup to talk to me, which never happens in my life. But a man came up, he waited there for like 45 minutes, and all he said, he shook my hand and he said, "I work at the Sheerness coal mine. I just wanted to meet you." And he walked away. Right? He's the person who's affected by the policy. And the more you broaden out to global and long-term and everything else, you're forgetting that within that cell in the spreadsheet, there is that guy. And I can see him like it was, is my uncle at the pulp mill. It's all of these sorts of things, and they're real people. When we talk about the rebates, do they make everybody better off? We tend to say that low-income people are made better off by the rebates. You look in the data, 20% of people in the lowest income are not, and those are the people we should be worried about. But as the broader you get, the more easy it is to make generalizations. So I think we got to remember, all policies local, policies kind of at, Ken and others will say it's at the doorstep. And the broader you get, the more global you get, the harder it is to make that case at the doorstep for something that we need to do here.
Good. All right, I think we have time for one last question, Paul.
So, one of the things at Ecofiscal that I thought that we never quite came to grips with, and I found I changed my mind over time, was the whole question of burden sharing. And, former environment deputy, I was very focused on how do we actually meet the target. The carbon pricing thing, that's great, but how do we actually meet the target? And so going into Ecofiscal, I was attracted to cap and trade, because I felt cap and trade will get me to the target. And you know, one of the things that in Ecofiscal, we talked about, well, we like all kinds of carbon pricing. We like cap and trade. We like carbon taxes. But, you know, and we never really came to grips with the fact that in a very important way, those things do not, those two forms of carbon pricing don't go together unless you have an important bridge. And so, you know, I mean, to say Ontario and Quebec, you can have cap and trade, and Alberta, you can have carbon pricing, and we have to get to the target doesn't work unless you're willing to have trading of carbon between provinces. And so, you know, it always bothered me that we never came to grips with that, but in a very funny way, I'm kind of glad now that we have more provinces that are subject to a federal carbon tax, because I've become convinced that the only way Canada works is for us to have a carbon tax. And that's because the only way to practically share the burden of meeting our target is to share it by everybody facing the same price. And the fact that emissions are low in Quebec and high in Alberta really can't make a difference for how if Canada is going to work. It has to be that everybody faces the same price. And Albertans will do what they have to do to respond to that price, and Quebecers will do what they have to do, and Ontarians will they have to do. It's something that Ecofiscal never really took on. It was always kind of under the surface. I think it's something that Andrew spoke about a number of times, but I think that it's an example of an issue that was better left unaddressed, to be honest, right? Because it would just start another argument. But now that we're at the funeral, I'm happy to say that there is an answer, and I think that the way things are going now is the right way. Anyway, thank you.
All right, I think that was a great way to wrap up this discussion, and I think we'll give Ecofiscal an A grade on all of the effort over the past number of years, and hopefully we give the panel the same. Thank you.
Beautiful.